So today we're going to cover a lot. So in this lecture we will talk about the organization of our nervous system. We will talk about the support of the central nervous system. So here you have a little sneak peek of the support where you see all these layers outside of the brain. Then we will talk about the blood supply that is needed and that goes towards the brain. So which arteries are necessary for this, etc. Then we will talk about where the neurons and glial cells come from. So kind of like their basic development. And then we will shed some light on the different types of neurons and the different types of glial cells. So in case you don't remember from the previous lecture, neurons are the information processing cells, whereas the glial cells are the supportive cells. So here you see a sneak peek of the table of the different glial cells. So they're there to help out. They're there for nutrition or support or defense, etc. Okay, so let's start off with the organization of our nervous system. So from an anatomical standpoint, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So those two are both encased in bone. So the brain is in the skull and the spinal cord is in the vertebrae. So in the peripheral nervous system consists technically of the rest. So this could be divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So here the somatic nervous system receives input from the spinal nerves and also from the cranial nerves. And the autonomic nervous system controls the functioning of the body's internal organs and technically orders them to either rest and digest through the parasympathetic nervous system or to fight and flight through the sympathetic nervous system. So within the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic division is calming and the sympathetic division is arousing. So in the book, there's a shift towards a more functional division. So here, the central nervous system, the somatic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system work together as an interactive system. So feel free to pause this and try to memorize all these parts. So again, the central nervous system is important for all our behaviors and consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Somatic nervous system is important for the transmission of your sensations and also the production of your movement. And this is split up into cranial nerves and spinal nerves. And then the autonomic nervous system, which balances your internal functions, is split up into the sympathetic division, which is arousing or fight and flight, and the parasympathetic division, which is calming, or we also say rest and digest. Okay, so I know I threw a lot at you just now, so let's go over a little recap. Our nervous system can be split up functionally in three ways. You have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The somatic nervous system, or the SNS, which consists of the spinal and cranial nerves. So this goes to and from the sensory organs and also goes towards the muscles, joints, and skin. And then lastly, we have the ANS, which is the autonomic nervous system, and this balances the internal organs through the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. Okay, so let's move on to the protection of our central nervous system. So our central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, has four key players that support and protect it. So the first one is the skull and the vertebrae. The skull, of course, we all know what that is. It's the bone inside of our head, and it is around our brain. Then we have the vertebrae, which is in our whole body, and it goes all the way down our back. The second key player are the meninges. These are three layers of membranes that are inside of the skull. The third key player is the CSF, or the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. And this is a liquid that is outside of your brain and also in certain little hollow pockets inside of your brain. And it goes around your spinal cord as well. And this is a liquid that is technically just a big cushion in case you fall or for sudden movements. So it has a supportive and protective function. And the fourth one is the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is exactly what it is called. It is a barrier between blood and brain. So it limits the movements from chemicals from the rest of our body to go into the CNS or into the central nervous system. So it's pretty strict. So let's go over these in a little bit more detail. So let's go over the first two first. So the skull and the vertebrae, we all know what that is. Here you see our beautiful skull. It is a bony structure around our brain. And then we have the vertebrae, which is a bony structure around the spinal cord. Then we have the three meninges. The meninges are 3 layers of membranes inside of the skull. So in this picture you see the skull right here and you see the brain right here. So the meninges again are between the brain and the skull. So we have three types of meninges. We have the first one is the dura mater, which means tough mother. This is the thickest one of the 3, and it's the most outside, so it's right under the skull. Under the dura mater, we have the arachnoid membrane, which is right here. It's the pink one. And then underneath the arachnoid membrane, we have the pia mater, which is right here. So the arachnoid membrane is in the middle, and it's a very thin sheet that follows the brain contours. So you can see right here, it kind of moves along with all the little bumps on the brain. And the pia mater is the inner membrane, and it's moderately tough tissue, and it clings on to the brain tissue. So this is tightly wrapped around the brain. So under the arachnoid membrane and above the pia mater, you have this space called the subarachnoidal space or subarachnoid space. So this space has a lot of CSF in it. Do you guys remember what CSF is? Okay, it's a cerebrospinal fluid, so don't forget that. And that is also for cushioning the brain. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So the third and the fourth supporters and protectors are right here. So the third one is the CSF that we just talked about. So the CSF circulates through the brain in certain little pockets that have CSF in them. And it also goes around the spinal column and within the subarachnoidal space around the brain in the meninges. So the fourth one is the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier limits the movements of chemicals from the rest of their body into the CNS. So remember how I said that glial cells are supporter cells to neurons? Well, there's one specific type of glial cells that specifically helps with the blood-brain barrier. So astroglia are glial cells that help form tight junctions to prevent many blood-borne substances from crossing the capillaries into the central nervous system tissue. So here you can see the endothelium, or a layer of cells outside of the blood vessels. And tight junctions are technically just little things that make the boundaries tighter together. So because there are tight junctions, nothing can really go through these two cells right here. So the blood-brain barrier is technically just a semi-permeable membrane that separates blood and fluid. So here you have the blood, here you have the brain, and here you have the blood-brain barrier. It does let some things through, but not everything. So it's very specialized, and it only lets certain types of nutrients through. Okay, so as I said in the previous slide, CSF is continuously being made and also being drained off into the circulatory system through connecting channels among the ventricles. So there is a congenital condition called hydrocephalus, and this means water brain. So this is when the outflow of these channels is blocked, and this can result in severe intellectual impairments and even death. That is mainly due to the buildup pressure that the cerebrospinal fluid creates. So here you can see a deceased baby from this. So as you can see, the head is way bigger. This is because CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, keeps being created, but there's no way for it to be drained off. Okay, so let's move on to blood supply. So where does the blood in the brain come from? So the blood in the brain comes from 2 internal carotid arteries and 2 vertebral arteries that supply all the blood to the brain. So here you can see the right internal carotid artery and the left one. And right here you can see the vertebral artery. So right here and here. So here you see the right one, and here you see the left one. So then these branch into the ACA, or the anterior cerebral artery, the MCA, or the middle cerebral artery, or the PCA, the posterior cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery gives blood to the medial and dorsal areas of the brain, so the medial and dorsal cortex. If you forgot what medial and dorsal means, please go back to the first video. The middle cerebral artery provides blood to the lateral surface of the brain, so the lateral surface of the cortex. And the PCA, or the posterior cerebral artery, provides blood to the ventral and posterior surface of the cortex. So whenever the blood has been brought to the brain, then the veins return blood back to the heart. So there are external and internal cerebral and cerebellar veins. However, the venous blood flow does not follow the exact same course of the major arteries. Okay, so here's a really cool picture of where which artery provides blood. So here we have the ACA, or the anterior cerebral artery, and it supplies blood to the dorsal and medial parts of the brain. So medial means in the middle, and dorsal means towards the top. Remember, dorsal fin from a shark? Then we have the MCA, or the middle cerebral artery. This provides blood to the lateral parts of the brain, so towards the side of the brain. And the posterior cerebral artery, or the PCA, supplies the ventral and posterior parts of the brain. So ventral is the bottom, remember, ventral view, we saw that in the previous lecture, and the posterior is the back of the brain. Okay, so where do neurons and glial cells come from? So the brain originates in a single undifferentiated neural stem cell. So this is a self-renewing multi-potential neural stem cell, and that will give rise to the different types of neurons and glial cells in our nervous system. So a stem cell has the capacity to self-renew itself. First, the stem cell divides and produces two stem cells, and then they divide again. Stem cells can also give rise to progenitor cells. So progenitor cells will then migrate and act as precursor cells and give rise to non-dividing primitive nervous cells, which are called blasts. So blasts are cells that cannot divide. So some of these neuroblasts differentiate into neurons, and others will differentiate into glial cells. So neurons and glial cells are the two basic brain cells that make up the entire adult brain. So I know that's a lot, so here I have a picture of it. So brain cells begin as multipotential stem cells, as you can see right here. So here you have stem cells. These are self-renewal, and these can divide and produce 2 stem cells. So then they can become progenitor cells, so you see right here. And after this, they will end up as either neural non-dividing blasts or glial non-dividing blasts. So these are cells that cannot divide any further because they're already getting specialized. And later on, they can get fully specialized into different types of neurons or different types of glials or glial cells. So again, the difference between neurons and glial cells is that glial cells help out, and neurons are the information processing cells. So they contain all the information. So I definitely don't want you to forget this pathway. So it goes from stem cells, these are self-renewal and can divide, then they become progenitor cells, and then these become either neuroblasts or glioblasts, and then eventually these specialize into whatever they end up being towards the end. So let's look at the different types of neurons. So neurons can differ in many, many ways. So they can be of different size, they can be of different shape, they can have different biochemistry, and obviously also have different activity. So there are 3 basic types of neuron that we have. And we have the sensory neurons, which you can see here in orange. We have interneurons in purple and the motor neurons in blue. So sensory neurons are neurons that transduce or technically change sensory information, and they change it into nervous system activity. So for example, when you touch a glass with ice water, when you feel the temperature of it, your sensory neurons in your hand will sense that, and they will change that into neuroactivity and send that information to the brain. So that's how you know, oh, this glass is very cold. Then motor neurons right here, motor neurons technically get orders from the brain and produce movements by telling the muscles what to do. So for example, if the glass is too cold, your brain will tell you, hey, the glass is too cold, don't touch it. And your brain will tell your motor neurons to take your hand away from the glass. And then interneurons are exactly what they're called. They link up the sensory and motor neuron activity in the central nervous system. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So the simplest sensory neuron is the bipolar neuron. So here you have the sensory neurons. The simplest one is the bipolar neuron right here. It has a cell body, which you can see right here, and it has a dendrite on one side and an axon on the other side. So here you see the dendrite, and here you see the axon. The dendrite takes the information, and then it goes past the cell body, and then the axon sends the information to the next neuron. So the information processing goes from the dendrite through the cell body to the axon to the next neuron. So a somatosensory neuron are neurons that we can have in our skin or in our muscles, and they take sensory messages such as touch, and they send it from the dendrites to the axons to the brain. So here you see that the cell body is not in between the dendrite and the axon. It's sticking out right here. So this will increase the speed of the message transduction. So here, information goes again from the dendrite but instead of going through the cell body, it just passes it and it goes to the axon. Okay, so next we have the interneurons, and again, we already talked about that, but interneurons link up sensory and motor neuron activity in the central nervous system. So there are many different types, and they all have a lot of dendrites with a lot of branching. But what they all have in common is that they only have one axon, like any other neuron. Sometimes it branches, but often they just have one axon. So the three most well-known interneurons are the stellate cell. Stellate means star, so it kind of looks like a star too. And these are, for example, located in a brain structure called the thalamus. Then we also have pyramidal cells, and these are located in the outer layer of our brain, which is called the cortex. And then we have the Purkinje cells, which are very densely branched cells, and these are located in the cerebellum, which is the little brain at the back of our brain. And then lastly, the motor neurons. Motor neurons that are located in the brainstem and spinal cord, they project to our facial and body muscles. So they technically produce all the movement. So all the movement that comes from the brain is produced through these cells. These cells are necessary to walk, or to frown, or to smile. And then we have the different types of glial cells. So here you have the 5 main ones. There are a bunch more, but let's talk about these 5 only. So we have the ependymal cell, which is a small cell, and this one is important for creating CSF. So this one creates the cerebrospinal fluid. Then we have the astrocyte. It looks like a star, it's very symmetrical, and it's very important for nutrition and also for support. So we talked about the astrocyte earlier when we talked about the blood-brain barrier. Then we have the microglial cell. This is a tiny cell, and it's very important for defensive function. And then my 2 favorites are the oligodendroglial cell and the Schwann cell. So these technically have the same function, but in different parts of our body. So they make this substance called myelin around axons in the brain and the spinal cord, which helps the information go faster. But we'll talk about these in more detail later on in later lectures. So that was it for this video, and I will see you all back soon.